evening, everyone. I am your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution podcast. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Before we start, if you're new to the channel, please hit subscribe and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you are alerted whenever we go live. We're constantly adding cross streams with other channels and adding new shows. Next Thursday, we'll be doing our bi-monthly news rundown with the guys from Left Reckoning. Also, we did our 16th episode of our leftist sports show, Beyond the Red Zone, with Mac and Marcus of the Left Flank Vets last night. And we'll be doing our Beyond the Red Zone fantasy football draft this month, August 29th. Additionally, if you like what we do here and you want to see it continue and you have the means to further support the channel, for our patrons, we have the exclusive Champagne Room, our post-show after-hours hang, where we have more ridiculous uncensored fun, usually watching some weird movies that would get the main show demonetized. Depending on your level of patronage, you can get exclusive TIR merch, and at any level, you can join us for our movie nights. And I decided we are adding an additional, more fun one for my birthday this Friday. So patreon.com/bitterlakepresents, and for as low as $30 for the year, you can join in on the fun. That being said, let me bring in the Tuesday night crew. First and foremost, my co-host, my homie, my dog, the man of the Mau Mau Hour, Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
How are you feeling today?
Feeling good. Feeling pretty good. Thank you for asking.
Interesting topic. Love having John on. I don't know if you remember, but the first time John came on, we wanted to kind of sort of take a shit on the 1619 project and the 1776 project. Those two things were kind of making a lot of news at the same time, and we were derailed because of a troll in the chat, if you will, and the whole show, all of us, me, you, and John Graham, yelling at this guy that kind of had their facts a little wrong. Do you remember that?
I remember that. I do remember that, as a matter of fact.
I don't want to mention that name. I feel like if you mention the name, it's like Candyman. You will summon the spirit, that trollish personality. Can't do that.
That would be a problem.
And that's what led us to actually even look for a moderator. And now we have the moderator to the stars. She is the headless voice of reason. I say headless in those spaces. M. Toussaint.
Hello. Hello, Jay. Hello, P. How are you guys?
To M. Toussaint.
I'm doing well.
Yeah? You look well.
Thank you.
I'm putting together the schedule for my Mau Mau Hour as we speak.
Nice.
And we know when Pascal does the Mau Mau Hour,
we coming for you, nigga.
Pascal, looking a little bit like a Caribbean dictator. A little bit.
No.
You go into his office, he's got the crazy chair. He's got the light colored shirts on. A little tropical, a little safari. All right.
Team of yes men around him at all time. What do you know what you want to talk about? Do you want to tease it, or you want to?
We're going to be talking about the pivotal decade, the 1970s, and what it means in terms of the rise of neoliberalism.
Oh my goodness!
Be surprised how many people love the crack.
Did you have a pet rock, either of you?
I did not have a pet rock.
I did not. You know what I did have that is of that era? there was a toy. It was an Evil Knievel thing, and it was a motorcycle and a little.
Oh, that was a great toy.
And you
That
wound
was
the thing
the
up,
bomb.
and it shot off. Yeah, I had that.
I had the same thing. That was an amazing toy. I'm surprised you remember Evil Knievel.
Oh my goodness, that was an Evil Knievel toy, and that thing jumped off anything and everything in the house that my parents had. They were still married at the time. How long ago it was? My parents got divorced.
Yes.
And they found out what it was. They're like, oh, we can leave. Peace.
Oh my gosh.
Do
That
you
went
remember that? Is
somewhere.
that toy before your time, Toussaint? I know
I
you're only 27. So.
I am the number of children that you have.
Wow.
One a year.
Do you remember? You don't remember that? That's before your time.
I don't think so. I don't think I remember that one.
She's too young to remember toys.
Care Bears.
This is way before Care Bears. This is actually a toy from when Pascal was little Pascal, and he had a ducktail and a natural.
Anyway.
Before he had a process.
Before he had-
Don't lie. A little texturizer action. That counts.
Pascal is right in between, like right after the conch, or before the really good S curls.
All right.
I've never had an S curl in my life.
That's a damn lie. You know, you had your shit
I did have
fried
waves, though. I did rock.
right to the side.
I was about to ask.
I did rock the waves, so.
360 waves.
He was getting him seasick. You was getting him seasick, Pascal.
I did rock the waves.
Many waves.
Rock the waves did not rock an S curl. That was not going to happen.
John
No
Graham is
S-curls,
like, what
no.
kind of colored tomfoolery do you guys have me on tonight? Y'all trying to get, I'm trying to get tenure over here, and y'all over here fucking up all my good shit.
What if he wants to be president?
He just wants benefits.
Keeping it simple.
Yeah, he said president can wait. Can I just get the benefits? Oh shit. Well, we actually had made the last time John was on, we actually talked about Indian residential schools, and it's been about a year since he's been on. So I figured we would, before we bring John in, maybe get you guys kind of acquainted with what we'll be talking about today, because even with residential schools, there was a minute last year where some of it came up in the news, but still I think a lot of what we know about the assimilation era, the Indian New Deal, and even the history of residential schools and the Reorganization Act is definitely forgotten history. So let's have a little bit of a quick refresher. Did you remember this one, Pascal?
I do remember.
Factory. News Magazine salutes Education Week with the film of an Indian residential school, 500 miles north of Toronto. Principal Eric Barrington dispenses first aid among his many other duties. He heads one of Canada's 69 Indian residential schools, scattered in key locations as far north as the Arctic Circle. They've a total of 11,000 pupils, orphans, convalescents, those who live too far in the wilderness to get to a daily school. They learn not only games and traditions, such as the celebration of St. Valentine's Day, but the mastery of words, which will open to them the whole range of the ordinary Canadian curriculum.
There is a notion that poisons the minds of many Americans, the myth of manifest destiny. The narrative that the vast, empty western lands of what we now call the United States was an untamed wild unknown filled with savages that could only be settled by a truly civilized people. In recent weeks, there has been breaking news from Canada that mass graves have been found near what were known as residential schools. These schools were boarding facilities with a long-standing partnership between religious institutions and national governments. Their goal was to isolate indigenous youth from their families, erase their customs and language, and assimilate them to the dominant culture. In the United States, Colonel Richard Henry Pratt was maybe the most impactful figure of the off-reservation schools. His goal was that of complete assimilation. His motto that became that of the system: kill the Indian, save the man. In this episode of This is Revolution, we'll take a deep dive into the insidious nature of the residential schools in the U.S. as well as Canada with historian John Graham. This is Revolution.
I got frightened when I was a little girl when the principal used to beat up the other children like boys. The boys got the most beating. They used to call it bench party, and it was usually done after supper. And that's where I got frightened, because I saw blood.
I remember when we had to shower. You want to have to show me how to shower and clean and wash myself, how to wash my private and my, private parts of your body. You don't have to show a kid once or twice at the most, but not every day. And have the supervisor come in there and basically take advantage of you.
Somewhere in these Chiricahua hills, no white man will ever know where, the Apaches buried Cochise, the greatest of their great chiefs. Geronimo faded into these hills, and it took 5,000 U.S. soldiers to bring him out. And now Time Life Books brings the great chiefs to life again as your introductory volume to a fast-writing series called The Old West. Hundreds of authentic pictures give you the real story. For the first time ever, you'll be able to see Geronimo's combat dagger and Colt 45. You'll look into the eyes of Sitting Bull, the man who destroyed Custer. Juana Parker, the fierce Comanche whose mother was a captured farm girl, and all the great chiefs. Eyewitness accounts and rare photographs and art bring the Old West to life. You'll meet the gunfighters. Men like John Wesley Hardin, so mean he once shot a man just for snoring. The cowboys, blazed in glory by the greatest artists of the Old West. The pioneers, battling the savage elements and bloodthirsty war parties. The gamblers, the women of the West. They're all here in big, handsome books with the look and feel of hand-tooled saddle leather. We'll send you the great chiefs for a 10-day examination. If you're not impressed, just return it within 10 days and pay nothing. If you decide to keep the great chiefs, you pay just $12.95 plus shipping and handling. Then approximately every other month, we'll send you another lively volume from the Old West Library for a 10-day examination. Keep only...
Whoever returned those things, like seriously.
I mean, I'm sitting here reflecting about how much this nativist zeitgeist had to be carried in those books. I mean, that's like, talk about the mythology of manifest destiny. I mean, those books are like living it. I remember those commercials and watching those, and you're like, what's going on here? But that's the mythology, right? That's the whole kind of like, yeah, we won the West.
And you can find them. I still, if I'm on tour, especially in the western region of the country, I love going in thrift shops and antique shops, and that stuff there is everywhere in antique shops. And I remember those commercials. I've always wanted to have one of those leather-bound books. Those commercials seem so cool, but as you read more about how the West really was settled what Manifest Destiny really looked like, you really find out how kind of hideous promoting that lie was to the American people. Um, well, many times when we discuss the New Deal, we view it from a Black American, white American perspective. Did one benefit more than another? That kind of discourse can be helpful at times and counterproductive as well. But there is one group that is often ignored in New Deal discourse, and that is the Native American population. It is understandable that many of us are aware of the abuse that was perpetrated on the Native population through the period of assimilation, mainly through the horrendous residential schools. But the National Indian New Deal attempted to right some of those wrongs. It has been estimated that more than 4 million acres of land were returned during this period. In spite of this, there were opponents of these reformative policies, as well as class contradictions, to educate us on this often forgotten chapter of United States history is maybe every undergrad's favorite history professor at Missouri State. Please welcome John Graham.
Certainly my favorite.
Good to see you again.
Good to see everyone.
John, really glad that you're here to explain this rather complicated history in the overall New Deal and Native Americans.
I've been looking forward to it all week. I love being on here with you guys. It's always a good time.
Well, MT, you wrote the first question, so why don't you go ahead and ask the first question?
I did rate the first question.
Well, you bumped my first question to your first question.
Yeah, because, first of all, it's me we're talking about here.
Oh.
But secondly, I wanted to ask a more general question to help set us up. So we did have some reading, and I wanted to know, why was it important to you to be one of the authors of this book that's geared towards teachers? Why not gear it towards the students or the general public?
Sure. So I got approached about this project as a way of trying to teach the New Deal to help K through 12 teachers especially understand this topic. And it was important to me to get involved because I'm a big advocate for a symbiotic relationship between K through 12 educators and college educators. We tend to be trained as content experts, whereas they are trained as pedagogy experts. And I think that means we have a lot of ability to benefit each other, to really help each other out. So we can provide content that may not have time to study or have opportunity to study, and we can look to them to figure out how do we build on the job they do teaching at the college level, as opposed to just passively lecturing at people for 50 minutes. So I'm just a big advocate for across that K through 12 college line cooperation, and this was a good chance to give back.
You wanted them to stop sending you dum-dums. No more dum-dums. Don't send us those.
That's right. Shape up, people. Use this book.
John, can you quickly tell us a little bit about what was happening before the Indian New Deal with this period of assimilation, and what the Bureau of Indian Affairs to want to redirect in its course in dealing with Native Americans?
Absolutely. So for the roughly 50 years before the period we're talking about tonight, it's known as the assimilation or maybe the allotment era, sometimes called that as well. And it's basically the period in which the Indian Wars in the West are drawing to a close. And so both government officials and reformers in general are trying to figure out, what do we do with Native Americans long term? Because of scientific racism at the time, there was this expectation, this fear, that because they were quote unquote inferior, they would simply die out without help, right? So just leaving them alone is cruel. It's inhuman. And so we have to do something to save them from themselves. And one sort of prong of that salvation plan, if you will, was the boarding schools that we talked about the last time I was on, where Richard Henry Pratt comes up with his famous phrase, kill the Indian, save the man, right? Destroy indigeneity in children in order to save them, in order to save the race through them. And then the other major prong of that, which is probably more relevant to tonight's conversation, was the Dawes Allotment Act. And the Dawes Allotment Act basically looks at reservations and it intentionally breaks them up into individual allotments where the head of every family gets 160 acres. And then once all that's been allotted, the idea is that you take the rest of the land that was guaranteed by treaty to be reservations, and you put it in the hands of the government in order to act as basically stewards for what they saw as wards of the state. And so the land obviously was mismanaged, it was lost, funds were. You can imagine the kind of corruption and incompetency with the funds from the land sales. But basically, the idea was they cannot survive and they're not useful to us as long as they're living sort of this communal lifestyle. So we need to teach them how to be individualistic, how to be selfish. That was actually a word that was used sometimes officially, so that they'll survive into the modern era. And so that was sort of the idea behind the allotment era: is how do we save Indians from themselves, with the subtext of how do we make them useful, right, in a rapidly industrializing nation in which we need access to both labor and to land, and they kind of have both sitting there and wasting it.
So, is it safe to say that the allotment and the pretext that was given to it ended up becoming a large scale land and labor grab from Native Americans?
Absolutely. It's. I think we have to take seriously that we have some people who honestly think they're doing what's best. But certainly part of that process for everyone involved is just the pragmatics of we need access to land and we need access to a permanent underclass labor force. And this is a good way of solving our Indian problem: is getting them off the land and getting them to work.
Was it also an indoctrination into capitalism as well? Because it seems like there's a lot of red baiting that I saw in some of the pushback.
Well, there definitely is, right? As the second industrial revolution is kind of taking off in the late 19th, early 20th century, you certainly have different groups in the United States trying to offer solutions to some of its more disastrous effects, especially on the working class. And so, in that context, not only is the socialism and communism get blackballed, but they also get associated with immigrants, right? Immigration equals socialism. And so now you've got like the double blackball of both nativism and racism, and then fear of socialism. And so I think it's fair to say that for some people, Native Americans in the West could be seen as a potential fifth column, right? If we don't win them over into our way of doing things, into our economic system, if we leave them as sort of this communal lifestyle, isn't that just setting up commies in the backyard?
Ooh. And then the big question is kind of the main centerpiece in this I don't want to say essay because it's in a textbook, but in your chapter, John Collier. Who is he? And do you view him as a complicated figure or a bit of an unrecognized hero?
Boy, he's an interesting guy. So Collier is part of this larger wave of white reformers who were really terrified about what they see as what they would call the forces of modernity, what they're doing to the United States economically, politically, socially. And so a lot of these guys like Collier actually start in the East, New York, places like that. Most of them fail. They kind of end up drifting to the Southwest, and they see in Native American cultures, especially the Pueblos in New Mexico, they see all the things they're looking for as a solution to modernity, right? I mean, it's a very romanticized view. It's kind of replacing the vicious savage with the noble savage. It's not realistic assessment of who Native Americans are, but it's how they make Native Americans useful for their own concerns, which are these concerns about modernity. So when you have someone like Collier, he very much is an advocate for Native Americans. He is very much staunchly against allotment and against assimilation, and is going to do everything he possibly can to reverse those policies and to reverse their effects. But at the same time, he's still someone who is doing things for Native Americans, not with Native Americans, and who sees himself as knowing what is best for them.
And what he was still somewhat of a cultural pluralist. Would you still describe him as a cultural pluralist?
Yeah, I think he is, in that he sees value. He sees significant value, even in some ways superiority, right, of Native culture to the white culture that's freaking him out at the time. but he also identifies it with it in some weird ways. In one of the articles he writes for public consumption about explaining his philosophy of the Indian New Deal, he refers to himself as white of skin but red of heart, which is
Oh,
all kinds
Wow.
of unpacking to do there. But I think that is Collier in a nutshell. He really does care. He really is trying to help, but because of uh, his limitations, right, in respecting and understanding Native American culture, and the way he flattens it based on his interactions with the Dene and with Pueblos, that's one really reasons that the Indian New Deal is a mixed bag, right? Because it does do things. It does restore tribal sovereignty, but along Western constitutional lines. It does restore some economic programs, but as long as they make sense, right, within the larger capitalist project. So if you ask me if he's a hero, I'm not comfortable with that word. I think he's better than what came before, for sure. But ultimately, I'd say he's a mixed bag.
So how does he re-envision education? Because he's also kind of against the residential schools.
He is. So he reimagines education as something that preserves Native American culture, while also preparing them for a place in American society and the economy. So on the one hand, you've got bilingual textbooks, right? You've got opportunities for Native American students to actually learn Native American arts in the boarding schools, which is kind of nuts, right? Because you have these institutions that are designed to destroy indigeneity, and suddenly in the 30s and 40s and 50s, they're actually helping to preserve it in some important ways. At the same time, though, the educational process is more, I don't want to say, I want to say it's more native user friendly, right, than actually Native American influenced and inspired, right? It's still kind of the same system in the sense that you're preparing them for a place in the same society. You're just trying to preserve their Indianness along the way.
Now, did the abuses stay in these new schools, or was that kind of a thing of the past now because these new schools are more native taught? They can speak their own language. I know that. So, of course, you need native teachers. So now are we kind of getting beyond the atrocious nature of the residential schools with these?
It's a good question. One of the big pushes of the Indian New Deal is to try to push more Native American students into public schools. And so they're facing kind of their own new challenges in the public school systems, where the boarding schools are still being used. Some of them are coming under much more Native influence, which means they are drastically improving. Others are kind of becoming drop sites for students who are seen as, for whatever reason, unruly or disruptive, or they can't be in public schools. And so, depending on the boarding school you're talking about, in 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, the path can be pretty different. But as far as a unified institution designed to destroy indigeneity, that's going to end really around the time of the Great Depression.
can you share with me your assessment and the role of the IRA, the Indian Reformation Act? What was actually the impact of that 1934 legislation on this whole process during the Indian New Deal?
Sure. So the main thing behind the Indian Reorganization Act, the main part is restoring tribal sovereignty. So the United States, in its early years, really up into, let's say, the mid to late 19th century, at least, is officially interacting with Native Americans on a government-to-government basis, right? I mean, that's at least officially on paper. I think in the, I'm going to say 1885 Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court rules that Native American nations are no longer domestic dependent nations, which is a fancy way of saying they're kind of like at the state level in the federal system. And now they're wards of the state. And so there is no recognized tribal nations for about 50 years. Oklahoma's a little confusing, or complicated rather, but basically there's no recognized tribal governments for 50 years. And so what the Indian New Deal does is it brings that back. It commits the United States to a return to government relations with Native Americans. Now, it does that by imposing American political ideals and structures onto these communities, right? So you have to have a constitution that follows the format given to you by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You have to have elections that look like U.S. elections. You have to basically, they're trying to impose American-style democracy on these communities, which may or may not be interested in governing themselves in that way, right? So that's kind of one of the biggest impacts of the Bureau of Indian Affairs is it does return us to those government-to-government relations, as complicated as that legacy might be. It also does provide economic funding for tribal governments they can use to get lines of credit or get other economic resources from the government. But again, that's as long as they play ball, right? They cooperate with the Indian Reorganization Act. And then it talks about school reform, which we talked about a little bit already. And then it also, it's not part of the IRA, but related legislation protects Indian crafts. It actually makes it a federal concern who can pass themselves off as Native American and sell their crafts that way. You can no longer fraudulently claim that you were selling Indian stuff, right? So, yeah, that's kind of the big stuff it does.
Now, what happened for the people that quote unquote played ball? What happened to these tribes? What happened positively to these tribes, and then negatively?
Sure. Well, positively, they get tribal government back. They get access to federal funds, which during the Depression is kind of a significant economic lifeline.
Mm-hmm.
They get any land that had not yet been distributed, that had been seized by the Dawes Allotment Act. That land is given back. About 4 million acres go back. Also, the IRA provides funds. I can't remember the exact amount, but it provides some annual funds to actually purchase land back that was lost to the Dawes Act. Now, nobody's going to force private landowners to give the land back, but there's some funding there. So if you ever looked at reservation maps and you wondered why a lot of them look like checkerboards, right? That's one of the reasons, right? Is the Dawes Act provides funding to buy a land back if people are willing, but they're not always willing. And that gives land back that had not yet been allotted. So those are positive things. They're positive changes. I would say on the negative side, for the tribes that did play ball, it can exacerbate tensions within the communities, right? We tend to flatten Native Americans just like Collier did, and don't realize that within these communities, there are more traditional and more progressive elements. There are those committed to assimilation as a survival instinct, opposed to those who are committed to traditional ceremonies and structures as a survival technique. And so, basically the government comes in and kind of declares winners, right? In some of these intertribal fights. And so that's a fairly negative consequence.
Well said.
Now, you write that I guess at some point were Native Americans, individuals, able to purchase land on their own and didn't necessarily like some of the policies that were being put forward?
So the Dawes Act, it provided those individual allotments, and then I forget all the specifics. I'm sorry, but if you tended the land a certain amount of years and did some other things, you could be given citizenship.
Oh.
And you could be given land ownership outright. So we're not talking about Indian citizenship across the board at this point. We're talking about individuals who, quite frankly, seem white enough to be trusted with citizenship, right? I mean, this is the era when blood quantum becomes a big obsession, because you need to know how much white versus Indian blood is in a person before you know how much you can trust them, right?
Wow.
So it's kind of almost like the reverse of the one drop rule, right? In some ways.
I am like that way with black people. If they're too light,
that's right. There's nothing I like more than discussing race with you, Jason, as a very pasty white man.
Well, it's okay, John. I know there's a few light-skinned people in probably in your department. Just know that I'm looking at them with a side eye.
Okay, I will keep an eye out on them. I will let you know. I'll report in from time to time.
Appreciate
about what they're up to.
No good.
So yeah. So anyway, there was a way to get land under the Dawes Act. You could end up with your own land, and so again, what we have to take seriously without making historical and moral judgments is that for some Native Americans, the way that seemed best to move forward was to assimilate as much as possible, to become become professionals, right? Living in cities away from reservations, de-emphasizing indigenous identity. And so now you have this act that is going to return land to the tribes, is going to return political power potentially to traditionalists within those tribes. And a lot of people aren't happy with that. They see it as moving backwards. They see it as bad for their tribe, and that's a real concern some people have.
What were some of the actual material benefits of some of the other policies of the New Deal? Did they actually help the Native Americans overall? The CCC, the Work Products Administration, those other more kind of quotidian elements, did they receive any kind of benefit overall? It's obvious that there was not the same kind of overall uplift of out of the poor into the middle class that we got with a larger white population as we see with African Americans. What about the other elements of the New Deal?
So the CCC does hire Native American workers, much like black workers. They're kept in separate camps, but they do work for that. The Work Progress Projects Administration. I'm going to get all my acronyms messed up, so someone correct me in the chat. Anyway, WPA. That sounds confident and safe. There we go. WPPA does produce a lot of buildings that are helpful for Native American communities, including day schools on the reservation, which are part of this migration away from off-reservation boarding schools to being schools closer to home. The PWA does hire Native American artists. There's a lot of really good public art that comes out of this. So yeah, I mean, of course, the PWA was also the way that FDR tried to support African Americans without upsetting his New Deal coalition, right? So, in some ways, I think the story of Native Americans in those programs would probably mirror what you would expect, right, based on your own studies.
Did you have a question, Pascal? You wanted to ask something?
I actually want to talk about what was the overall effect on the governance structure within the tribal infrastructure of things like the IRA and these other bills. How did it affect the way in which the tribes were able to govern themselves?
Mm-hmm. So you had to create a constitution that used the template provided by the federal government, which means you had to identify leadership by American methods, right? Elections, that sort of thing. Whereas for some communities, depending on how traditional they still are, right, political power is pretty insignificant compared to spiritual power, or sometimes it's sort of a smokescreen to protect the spiritually powerful leaders from the Spanish or other invaders historically, right? So now all of a sudden, you've got communities that are being forced to sort of ascribe power to individuals or through methods that are not what they traditionally would use. And they're being set up with these constitutions that do things like resolve conflict between parties in ways that they're not necessarily going to do traditionally. So it's kind of a gamble that the tribes have to take, right? I mean, is self-government worth it on these terms? And about 200 eventually say yes, and about 77 say no, for different reasons. Because either they don't trust the government, or because they are kind of pissed off at Collier personally, or because they say, no, we're going to hold out for real self-government. This is not something you're going to buy us off with. Does that answer your question?
There was a quote that you had, and I'm going to mess it up, so I'm just going to give the gist of it.
As long as I sound good, I don't care.
Well, it was a quote you put in it where someone said, years later, you can't be self-governing when you're governing with the permission of another nation. I'm saying it all wrong.
That was one of the reasons that the Seneca Nation in New York actually rejects it. In fact, it's kind of fun. The Iroquois Confederacy actually declares war on Germany in World War I and World War II on their own. They don't declare it as part of being part of the United States. So they're really committed to this idea that we're going to practice sovereignty on our terms. You'll either acknowledge it or not.
And how does this work out for them financially?
Well, lines of credit are available, so they are able to build some infrastructure. They are able to invest in native-run businesses. They are able to invest in native-run arts and crafts. So there are some real benefits. But at the same time, the tribal economies, I guess, for lack of a better term, they have to make sense to the federal government, right? So a great example of this is the Dene, the Navajo. And one of the reasons they actually reject the IRA is because Collier submits them to the same herd reductions, right, that FDR uses across the South to try to bring things like pork and cotton under control. They go into Navajo country and they actually like wipe out a significant amount of their herds. Not failing to understand not only obviously the economic consequences of that, but the social and cultural consequences as well. For the Dene, often their animals are much closer to family than just like breeding livestock. So again, as with the governments, you have this this opportunity to become more economically autonomous, more economically successful, but it has to be on the terms established by the federal government. It has to be in a way that makes sense to them, right? And so ultimately, for Collier, having a bunch of, in his mind, extra sheep running around is just going to destroy tribal resources and land. So let me help you out, right? Let me do what is best for you and take care of this problem for you. I don't know why you guys are so ungrateful.
Someone asked a question, and I've heard this talked about. We talked about it before about the 5 civilized tribes. Can you discuss this phenomenon, what it meant, and what exactly were the impact of that phenomenon on the way Native Americans were treated during the New Deal?
Yeah. So the five civilized tribes are a nickname that's given to the Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole. And it is a name given to them by their American neighbors based on their perception that these 5 tribes are more civilized than other neighboring tribes. And one of the reasons that perception is given is that each of these tribes in different ways tried to mimic American culture and American political institutions as a way of trying to stave off settler invasion. So it's not a capitulation. It's more of a sense of, well, maybe if we kind of look more like you, you guys will actually respect us and leave us alone. So you have the Cherokee, for example, adopt an alphabet. They have a written language. They invite missionaries to train their children, hoping that that will cause people to back off. And the 5 civilized tribes also adopt slavery. They adopt Southern slavery as well. It looked kind of like the South, and not everyone had slaves, obviously, but it's still a part of the economy and the culture. And so when they are relocated in the 1830s to Oklahoma, they are given assurances by the federal government that that land will be theirs forever, do with what they want, because at the time, no one wanted Oklahoma. And so when the Dawes Act comes around, they kind of get left out of it in Oklahoma, in part because of this sort of weird historical condition with the U.S. government, also because Oklahoma politicians really don't want Oklahoma reservations popping up, right, where there weren't any. This of course gets into the very recent court case of McGirt and what that does for tribal sovereignty and for political for a state sovereignty for Oklahoma. And so the 5 civilized tribes in Oklahoma in general kind of get left out originally of the Indian Reorganization Act, and they get brought in. I forget the name, but with a different act 2 years later that is kind of a compromise, in that it's sort of a diluted IRA, right? It does give some rights, it does give some benefits to the tribal nations in Oklahoma, while trying to avoid some of the more radical returns to the tribal sovereignty because of pushback from Oklahoma, right? Because if you look at Oklahoma, if suddenly all of the tribal nations in Oklahoma suddenly became self-organizing and controlled their own land and had their own court system that controlled everything, which is one of the things the IRA wanted to do, and it would have been a disaster for Oklahoma, which is why they still push back today.
And Oklahoma was Indian territory.
Yes.
That's why it becomes a state so late.
Yeah, exactly. There weren't enough white people around to make a real state, so got to be careful.
And is that the same way they look at Alaska?
Alaska is kind of its own thing, only because when we bought it from Russia, it had been like not really charted and it was very remote, and so the United States government doesn't really enter into the same sort of treaty relationships with Alaskan villages. I don't really recognize them as tribes for quite some time, just because it's not really a thing they think they have to worry about as far as numbers and as far as accessibility and that sort of thing. So Alaska also gets kind of gets left out in a different way, at least at first. I think today there are 200 plus Alaskan communities recognized as tribes by the federal government now. So it does happen. It just takes a while.
We do have a super chat that just came through from Charles. He asks, how was this applicable or not to Native Hawaiians after statehood?
Mm. That is a really good question. I would say that legally, the United States has tended to treat Native Hawaiians as a different category than Native Americans. And so I could not really outline for you the history of indigenous rights for Native Hawaiians, but I would tell you it's its own chapter. It's not really related to this chapter, at least not directly.
Can I ask a question about the schools?
Yeah.
You were on before, and you told us about the horrific nature of the crimes done against the Native American children in the boarding schools. So when Collier takes over and creates the day schools, do they also have the same abuses taking place? Less, different ones?
On the one hand, the history of day schools is not well known. Not a lot of research has been done on them. I think it's reasonable to guess, to assume that since these are institutions that are located in the communities, and students are going there for basically regular school hours, then going home, and given the fact that Collier is committed to a non-assimilationist method, that if there is abuse at these schools, and one would kind of assume there was somewhere, it's not going to be systematic and it's not going to be overlooked the way it would have been at the residential schools in their heyday.
I wanted to ask, what do you think is the overall legacy of the Indian New Deal, and how, when it seems like it was dispatched in towards the end with so abruptly and just kind of tossed to the wayside, so that none of the actually advances or benefits were able to develop.
So in the short term, a lot of it gets pretty short circuited. You're right, as the termination era comes with World War II and then with the Cold War. That era happens in part because the United States doesn't want to commit funds anywhere it doesn't have to. It's in incredible debt from the war. But also it happens in part because, well, it's just part of the Red Scare, right? Anybody that doesn't look like the rest of us is dangerous. Anybody that wants to be different is suspect, that sort of thing. So in the short term, by the 50s, most of the New Deal, any New Deal is not necessarily all revoked, but it's not really functioning. So I think its greatest legacy long term is the way that it does inspire generations of activists in the future. In the 1960s, 1970s, a lot of Indian activists are using memories of the Indian New Deal and using sort of that taste of self-government, of economic, not independence, but improvement. And they're using that as a way of saying, well, we're not going back now. We're not going back to being wards of the state now. We're not going back to being purely impoverished communities now. We're not having some sort of indigenous influence on our education now, right? So even if it's short term didn't do a whole lot, I think long term it provides inspiration for a lot of things that do happen that are of permanent benefit in the decades to come.
And I want to ask, how long does this Indian New Deal last? Does it last throughout the FDR and Truman administration? Or after FDR is gone, do the funds for this kind of dry up? And where are we now with the Bureau of Indian Affairs with Deb Haaland leading?
So, I'm trying to think. I'm going to say this boldly. I don't think any Indian New Deal legislation gets officially overturned or repealed. I probably am missing something, and someone's going to correct me, which is fine. But it kind of fizzles out in that the New Deal New Deal liberalism finds champions in the decades to follow, right? Truman, JFK, LBJ, those guys would kind of generally follow this modern liberal New Deal liberalism. But Native Americans don't find that kind of champion. They don't, not after FDR. Really, the next president that is helpful to Indian country in any real way is Nixon, of all the random people that you might not suspect.
Millhouse. He did do some okay things. Some
Who?
okay things.
OSHA. You get OSHA with Nixon.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So the federal government turns to a policy of actually going back on a lot of the philosophy of the Indian New Deal, at least, and then it sets up this termination era in which the Congress actually looks for tribes where it can terminate its special federal relationship with that tribe. It actually is looking for reasons not to return them the reservations, but to cut off federal aid, to cut off economic incentives and contracts. It's very much trying to end any sort of treaty-based or special relationship with the federal government right on the heels of finally returning to a government-to-government relationship. So,
And now, is the Bureau of Indian Affairs finally in good hands, or is it kind of the same thing, different player?
well, we'll see. For the first time ever, we've got the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland. She's Native American, and she's appointed some very important Native Americans to important posts in that organization or in that department, which includes the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so I'm optimistic. I mean, just this past year, the federal government actually studied and acknowledged that it ran boarding schools, right?
Yeah.
So that's something.
But is that the Canadian model, though? Like, hey, we'll acknowledge this. Ain't nothing going to change.
That is what remains to be seen. And I just don't know. The United States, well, as with any settler or capitalist society, has a vested interest in seeing itself in very certain ways, right? And even now, when we acknowledge past wrongs, we don't do jack shit about them, right? It's like, it's really sad that we kill all those people and that we carved faces into their mountain, but we're not giving the mountain back. And, maybe we will hire an Italian to cry on camera about how we're destroying the environment, and that'll help. So, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know how optimistic I am, other than there are at least Native people in key spots for the first time ever. And the Biden administration has a much different perspective and attitude towards Native American tribal nations than the Trump administration did. So it's a more friendly administration.
Do you think? That being said, do you think we're not going to see as much drilling on native land, or is that just foregone conclusion and this is just what we do here?
Well, the Biden administration pushed back on some of the leases that the Trump administration had set up. It's reversed those or canceled those. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be a complete cynical bastard, but here's the deal. We are a 300 million person country that consumes like a sixth of the world's resources because we are greedy fat asses, metaphorically, literally, right? And so at the end of the day, how much is anybody going to give a shit about Native American tribal land if gas goes up a certain amount, or if they don't have enough electricity for their fifth video game system? I don't know. I'm also kind of grumpy tonight, so maybe you ask me in the morning after some sleep. Maybe I'll feel better.
It's because the Cowboys lost in preseason to my Broncos. That's why.
That's right. It's hard to believe there could be a God when things like this happen, but that's all right.
Pascal, did you want to ask something?
Someone asked this might sound like a Pollyanna-ish question, but it's not. Does our guest think there'll ever be a point where we'll be like Canada and have better race relations as a country, or are we doomed to be more like Australia? Well, Canada has its own racial turmoils now. Let's not exactly romanticize Canada per se.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
We've done several shows talking about the racial contradictions in Canada. We've done at least 2 or 3 shows, as a matter of fact.
Yes, we have.
Canada enjoys a very good reputation, partially because it has a weirdo neighbor.
Yeah, because it's north of the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, there's someone making some sort of statement about a class action lawsuit that happened um, with the residential schools in Canada. I mean, overall, Canada is kind of known for making blanket apologies
Mhm.
and not really doing that much in righting said wrongs. I mean, spend a little bit of time in Vancouver or Edmonton, where that great big mall is.
Well, when your neighbor to the south has an old refrigerator on his lawn with a swastika on it, your home looks pretty good. That's kind of how it goes. You can keep up your lawn just fine.
Well, I have a question. Because I'm still learning about um, just what happened to the land during slavery in the United States and how it is still sort of trying to recover from that. So, with the Native Americans back during this time, more was done than just stealing their land. What else did they do to the land?
Well, the way the West was won really wasn't by military conquest. It was won because they destroyed the possibility of their competitors to continue their way of life. They super murdered all the buffalo. They built railroads through the best hunting grounds. They claimed the best farming grounds. Forts got set up on good land. So all that was left to Native Americans in the West, and a little generalization, right, is some pretty rough land.
Mhm.
The land, it's easy to set up a reservation when you have all the land that you want now, right? Oh, you guys go over there. That we're sorry.
Mhm.
Here's the dirt. You'll be fine.
It's like that King of the Hill episode where John Redcorn got his land and it was next to the freeway.
That's right. Yeah.
Aw.
There you go.
Well, there's some controversy about overgrazing
Mhm.
that they were
Yeah,
given that land. Hmm.
for sure. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. The West gets filled with herds of sheep and cattle and other animals that just tear up the land. Yeah, and definitely make it less valuable, less useful, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap this up, we're going to be moving this conversation, this cheery conversation, into the patron-only champagne room. John, you are a sports fan, correct?
I am. I have the heart of an athlete and the body of a quadriplegic. So I'm useless on the field, but will cheer you on from the side of it.
And you are a Cowboys fan, if I'm not mistaken.
I will acknowledge that if necessary for the show to keep going. Yes.
I do want to acknowledge this one comment. I have also, too, worked with very intelligent Native American people in the United States. I would not say that Canada is better. I haven't seen much difference in the overall treatment, other than one is nicer in general to others.
Canada is one England and one France in a trench coat.
And
We
if
have,
your homeless population is predominantly native,
yeah.
then maybe, just maybe, Canada isn't better per se. It just looks better because they have better rhetoric.
Well, they did say
And the,
please the land, so that matters. Can't ignore that.
and the Prime Minister has cool socks. We have a super chat. Can we answer this in the champagne room?
You can go ahead and answer it now.
Okay. Is this is from JB? Is John at all familiar with the Mohawk Aquasane? Oh, sorry, Aquasane, the Warrior Society, Yannikina, in upstate New York. I butchered everything. I'm sorry.
We gotta have some people start calling in when they do that.
For real, right? You say it. He can
No,
probably say it.
I don't honestly know very much about Mohawk history past the Revolution. That's why I studied in graduate school. There are excellent work, including excellent work by indigenous Mohawk scholars who can catch people up who would like to know the more modern history. Great stuff being written. It's not my area.
Fair enough.
And before we go, I do have to do this. because there are many bills we have to pay for the show. We pay these bills with Pascal smiling face.
Merch.
You can get Pascal's smiling face. It's a very rare thing to catch a smiling Pascal. Central Committee. This is Revolution. Mouse pad and mug combo. Bam! And you can also get Pascal's face right here. Look at that. Smiling face on the mug. You can get Koopa looking like Spy, even though he's Polish.
I like my coffee like my Marxists, right? There you go.
We're going into the bonus champagne room to talk more shit with John Graham. John, since you are a football fan, and I know this
Yes.
because we are Facebook friends.
Yes, we are.
There's so many things we want to talk about with you. Also, you know, one of these days when we get Cornell West to finally come on the show, we got to get you and Cornell on the show and have a great big Jesus off.
Oh man, nothing sounds better than that. That would be.
Well, I do want to talk about Marx and religion at some point.
Sure.
But seriously, I just watched the Manti Te'o Netflix documentary, and I literally was in tears at the end.
I haven't watched it yet. We'll discuss that next time.
We will have to discuss that and so much more silly, fun, and serious things in the champagne room. Thank you guys all for watching. Thank you guys all for your questions. For those of you listening to the show when it comes on the audio only, leave a comment, leave a review. Just move the show to a whole different category.
And know that you're missing all this.
You got a great voice, so you know.
True.
Your social media is going to just skyrocket after this.
I'm telling you, I do it for the popularity and for the token black friends for political campaigns in the future. That's why I do it.
There you
You
go.
might want to be president.
Yeah. So that's really the goal here. So I'm gonna get myself one of those mugs and pass them out eventually.
Toussaint, you know who doesn't want to be president?
Pascal, because he hangs out with you.
Ooh.
You're never going to be president, Jason.
That's mean.
You don't want to be president anyway. You want to have 27 kids. They wouldn't let all of them in the White House.
I would
I'm
have
not
to
You
at a White
don't
House.
need dream killers in your life, Jason. You gotta get better Facebook friends. You know.
Dream killers.
You guys are mean. I could be president. The White House would be a little more ethnic. It might resemble more of a Good Times Moesha kind of episode
That's my mama.
if I'm in it.
With heavy music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Classic yacht rock for when Pascal visits.
We have to also, John actually said, can we finish the yacht rock conversation with Pascal?
I
Because
think we have to.
the
think
real
we have
deal
to.
conversation that we have to have in the champagne room also is Frankie Beverly. Is it Black Yacht Rock?
Oh God, here we go.
Pascal says no.
There's no such thing as black yacht rock.
Oh my God, yes. Negroes can have yachts.
Like three of them.
Yeah. I didn't say it was big. Negroes can have yachts and ski-doos. And what else do they have?
I know friends. I know people who ski. I have friends who are literally at Martha's Vineyard right now.
And what are they doing?
They're probably
Listening to
music.
Earth, Wind, and Fire. Body, yeah. We got all the money. Body, yeah.
Not just in September, all year round.
Year round. Just throwing it up in the air, doing snow angels on it. Oh yeah, Black Yacht
A little
Rock.
Michael McDonald just to keep it fresh, you know. A little diversity.
Right.
Well,
Who
thank
doesn't
you,
like
John.
Michael McDonald?
Thank you, MT. Thank you, Pascal. Thank you, everybody, for watching the show. Quickly join us in the champagne room because we have to hurry in there I'm doing shows all this week, so we won't be there that long. And we're also doing the special birthday. My birthday is Friday, birthday night, movie night. Excited about that. So thank you guys, and we are out.